She was 18 years old and turned out of the only home she had ever known, with no family left to claim her and no money to speak of, just a battered brass compass that had belonged to her uncle and $11 folded into the lining of her coat. With that $11, she bought a sway-backed mule and a week of hardtack and set out across the flats toward Coyote Ridge, because there was nowhere else in the world she had any right to go. But what nobody knew, not the townsfolk who watched her ride out, not the men who had signed her away, was that somewhere between the salt pan and the ridge lay the missing supply convoy that half the territory had been searching for, and that Alice Fletcher would be the first living soul to find it, and that its wagons were carrying something that would change her life forever. Settle in and stay close, and before we go any further, let us know down in the comments where you are watching from tonight. Alice Fletcher had been born in a 2-room adobe on the north edge of a mining town called Bracken Wells, the only child of a freight hauler named Thomas Fletcher and a schoolteacher named Ruth, and for the first 11 years of her life she had believed, without ever needing to say so, that the small, warm world of her family was the shape the whole world took. Her father drove ore wagons between the stamp mill and the rail line at Ash Fork, and he was gone often, and when he came home he smelled of axle grease and creosote, and he would sit her on his knee and let her turn the pages of the freight ledger while he read out the numbers. Her mother taught the town's children in a whitewashed schoolhouse behind the church, and she taught Alice at the kitchen table in the evenings, arithmetic and penmanship and the names of the plants that grew along the arroyo. And she had a way of laughing that made Alice feel she had done something clever, even when she had only asked a question. The fever came through in the spring of Alice's 11th year, and it took her mother in 5 days and her father in 9. And when it was over, Alice was standing in the yard in a dress that no longer fit her, watching 2 men from the burial society roll a barrow toward the wagon track, and there was no one left in the adobe but her. She was taken in that same week by her father's older brother, a wagon master named Reuben Fletcher, who had never married and who lived alone in a plank house at the edge of a stage stop called Dry Bend, 40 miles south. Reuben was a tall, stooped man with a gray mustache and hands that had been broken and set more than once, and he did not know what to do with a grieving child, and so he did the only thing he knew how to do, which was to teach her the work of his hands. For 7 years he taught her, patiently and without much speech, and she learned. She learned to grease a hub and reset a fellow and shoe a mule that did not want to be shod. She learned to read the sky for weather and the ground for tracks and the ears of a team for what the team was thinking. She learned the names and prices of every article a freight wagon might carry between El Paso and the Colorado line, and she learned the honest weight of a barrel by the sound it made when you wrapped it. And she learned the dishonest tricks that a bad driver used to shave a load. Reuben carried in the breast pocket of his coat a brass pocket compass with a chipped glass and a needle that swung true, given to him by a trail scout he had ridden with as a young man. And when Alice was 15, he pressed it into her palm one evening at the supper table and closed her fingers around it and said only, "You'll want to know which way is north." And after that, the compass was hers. He died in the fall of her 18th year, quietly, in the chair by the stove, with a cup of coffee gone cold in his hand, and Alice buried him herself on the rise behind the plank house because there was no one else to do it. She had believed, in the flat childlike way one believes things when there is no reason yet to know better, that the plank house and the small paddock and the mule shed and the little bit of money Reuben kept in a tobacco tin under the floorboards would come to her, because she was the only kin he had left in the world, and because she had done the work of a grown hand for 3 years without complaint. She was wrong about this, as it turned out. In the particular administrative way that the world reserves for young women who have not learned yet to ask for anything in writing. Reuben had left no will. His half-brother from a first marriage nobody in Dry Bend had ever met arrived from Santa Fe on the 4th day after the burial. A soft man in a black coat named Marcus Holloway, with a lawyer's paper folded in his breast pocket and a look on his face that suggested he had already counted the rooms. He was polite to her. That was the part she would remember later, sitting on the mule with the compass in her coat and the flats opening out before her. How polite he had been. He had offered her a cup of her own coffee in her own kitchen, and he had explained, in the slow, careful voice a man uses with a horse he is not sure of, that the property and the stock and the tobacco tin under the floorboards were now, by law and by blood, his. He had offered her a week to gather her things. He had offered her, when the week was up, $11 for the mule she had raised from a foal, and he had counted the coins out onto the table one by one, and she had watched them stack, and she had not argued, because Reuben had taught her without ever saying so, that a person who argues from a losing position only teaches the winner how much they have lost. She had signed the paper he slid across the table with the same steady hand she used to sign a bill of lading, and she had thanked him for the coffee which was hers, and she had gone out to the paddock in the last of the afternoon light to begin the business of leaving. There was not, in the end, much to gather. Reuben had lived plainly, and she had lived more plainly still. She folded her second dress and her one good shirt into a flour sack. She rolled the wool blanket from her cot and tied it with a length of harness twine. She took the tin cup and the tin plate and the horn-handled knife she had used every day of her life at Dry Bend, and she took the small whetstone Reuben had kept by the stove, and she took a coil of picket rope and a hoof-pick and a farrier's rasp with a worn wooden grip, because these were her tools, and Marcus Holloway did not know their names. She took the brass compass out of the drawer where she had put it after the burial and slid it into the inner pocket of her coat, and she felt its weight settle there against her ribs like a second heart. She left the tobacco tin under the floorboards because the paper she had signed said it was not hers, and she was not a thief, though she thought about it for a long minute standing over the loose board with her boot on it. She fed the mule an extra measure of corn that evening and slept in the tack room on a folded saddle blanket, because Marcus Holloway had already moved his valise into the room that had been hers for 7 years and shut the door. In the morning, she was up before the light. She saddled the sway-backed mule herself, and she cinched the flour sack and the blanket roll behind the cantle, and she tied on a canvas water bag she had traded a spare bridle for at the stage stop the day before. She counted her coins in the gray dark of the yard. $11, the price of a mule she had raised from a foal, the whole of her fortune, folded into the lining of her coat where the stitching had come loose and could be pushed back closed with a thumb. Marcus Holloway came out onto the porch in his shirt sleeves as she was leading the mule through the gate. He said her name once, not unkindly. He asked her where she meant to go. She told him Coyote Ridge, because it was the only place west of Dry Bend she had ever heard Reuben speak of without cursing, and because a person asked such a question by a person like Marcus Holloway ought to have an answer ready. He nodded as though the answer satisfied some private list in his head, and he wished her luck, and he went back inside and shut the door. She did not look back at the plank house. She had already done her looking in the tack room in the dark, and she did not intend to spend any more of her strength on a building that no longer belonged to her. The flats west of Dry Bend ran for 2 full days before they broke against the first low shoulders of the Coyote Ridge country, and Alice Fletcher rode them at the walk because the mule was old and the sun was already thinking about being cruel by mid-morning. The land out there was the color of old bone, and it was flatter than any table, and the only things that stood above the level of a man's knee were the greasewood and the crooked stumps of yucca and once the bleached rib cage of a cow that had died walking. She rode with her hat pulled low and her collar turned up against the grit, and she watched the ground the way Reuben had taught her to watch it, reading the tracks of jackrabbit and coyote and the long straight prints of a pronghorn that had crossed her line before dawn. She stopped at mid-morning to let the mule blow, and she chewed a corner of hardtack softened in her mouth, and she stopped again at noon in the thin shade of a leaning ocotillo, and she poured a palmful of water into the crown of her hat and let the mule drink from it, because a mule that will not drink is a mule that will not walk, and a mule that will not walk in country like this is a mule that will kill you. By the second afternoon, the wind had come up out of the southwest, and it carried the smell of alkali dust and something sharper underneath it, mineral and faintly sweet, that she could not name. Her lips had split at the corners, and her knees ached from the long day in the saddle, and her shoulders had gone stiff from holding the reins one-handed against the pull of the wind. She thought, once, of Reuben in the chair by the stove with the coffee gone cold in his hand. And she thought of her mother at the kitchen table with the primer open between them. And she thought of her father with his big freighter's hands lifting her onto the seat of an ore wagon when she was small enough to fit inside his coat. And she did not cry. Because crying used water she did not have to spare, and because she had learned long ago that grief was a thing you carried the way you carried a load, distributed evenly and lashed down tight so it would not shift on the grade. The ridge came up on the western horizon in the last hour of the second day, a low blue smear against the paling sky, and she pointed the mule's nose at the highest notch of it and let him find his own pace. She camped that night in the lee of a lava outcrop with the mule picketed at the end of the rope and the blanket wrapped around her shoulders, and she took out the brass compass and opened it in the last of the firelight and watched the needle settle north. And she thought that a needle that swung true was a small enough thing to be grateful for at the end of a hard day, and she closed the case and put it back against her ribs and slept. She woke before the light with the taste of salt on her teeth and the same faint, sweet smell in the air, stronger now that the wind had settled. She rolled her blanket, cinched the flour sack behind the cantle, and drank 2 swallows from the water bag, and gave the mule 2 more. And then she rode. The land west of the lava outcrop began to break into shallow washes and low humpbacked ridges of caliche, and the sweet mineral smell rode the draws like water finding its own channel. And she followed it because Reuben had taught her that a smell on the wind will always lead you to its source if you are willing to be patient about it. By mid-morning, she had come to the lip of a dry wash wider than any she had crossed, its bed pale and hard, and she pulled the mule up short and sat very still in the saddle and looked down. There were wagons in the wash. She counted 6 of them, drawn up in the broken line of a convoy that had tried to circle and had not finished the circle. 3 abreast and 3 trailing, canvas bonnets bleached the color of bone and torn along their ridgepoles, tongues down in the dust, wheels canted where the sand had worked around the felloes. The lead wagon lay on its side with a rear axle snapped clean and one wheel gone entirely from the hub. The tailboard of another had been pried open and left hanging on a single strap of leather. There were no mules in the traces. There were no mules anywhere. Where a team should have stood there were only scattered bones and pieces of cut harness laid out in the dust, as though a careful man had gone down the picket line with a knife. She rode down into the wash slowly, one hand on the mule's neck, and dismounted at the tail of the lead wagon and tied the mule to a spoke and stood a long while listening for anything alive. And there was nothing. Only the wind pulling at the ragged canvas and a sound like paper turning in an empty room. 3 men lay in the shade of the wagons. One was still in his coat and had a canteen strapped across his chest, empty, and the second had crawled some distance and lay face down with his arms folded under his head as if he had lain down to rest. The third was only bones and a hat. She had seen dead men before, though not so many at once, and she did what Reuben would have done, which was to take off her own hat for a moment and put it back on and go about the necessary work of understanding. The freight was Studebaker built. Red paint sun-bled to the color of old brick. Iron tires still sound. She counted the barrels she could see through the torn canvas. Flour, coarse ground meal, a keg of molasses split at the seam and long since crusted over, a sack of dried beans burst and half emptied by rats and birds. Ordinary provisions. But behind the flour barrels in the second wagon and stacked tight in the third and the fourth were small square crates of a size she had never seen on any freight bill, banded with iron and stenciled only with numbers. No consignee, no destination, no weight declared. She laid her hand on the top of one, and it was heavier than any crate of dry goods had a right to be. And the sweet mineral smell was thicker here, and she understood that the smell was not from anything the convoy had been said to carry. She got down her farrier's rasp and her horn-handled knife and set to work on the nearest crate with the patience Reuben had taught her, which was the patience of a person who means to open a thing without ruining what is inside. The iron bands she pried up one nail at a time, saving each nail in the crown of her hat, and the pine boards she worked loose along the grain because green pine will split if you hurry it. When the lid came up, she set it aside and folded back a layer of oiled canvas and stopped. Inside the crate, packed in sawdust and wrapped each in its own square of waxed paper, were ingots of silver, dull gray along the edges and bright where a corner had rubbed, stamped along the top with a die she did not recognize. She counted 20 ingots in the one crate. She counted 12 crates in the second wagon and 8 in the third, and could not see clearly into the fourth. She sat back on her heels in the shade of the torn canvas and did not touch the silver for a long minute, because she had been raised by 2 careful people and then by a third, and none of them had ever taught her to grab. Then she got up and went to the lead wagon where the driver in the coat lay, and she looked for what a wagon master would have carried. And under the buckboard seat, behind a false panel of thin plank that had been slid crooked in some last hurried motion, she found a flat tin box and a canvas satchel wrapped in oilcloth, and she carried them out into the light. The tin box held gold coin, double eagles stacked in paper rolls, more money than she had known existed in one place. The satchel held a folded waybill, a small leather-bound book, a horn-handled pocket knife with a bone inlay worn smooth, and a letter, 4 pages long, written in a slow, careful hand on the ruled paper of a freighter's ledger, and folded once and addressed on the outside in pencil to whoever finds this. She sat down against the wheel of the lead wagon in the strip of shade and opened the letter and read, "My name is Amos Kettleman, and I have been a wagon master on the southern freight roads for 26 years, and if you are reading this, then I did not come through, and the wagons did not either. I am writing this on the second night out of Fort Purgatory, with the fire low and the men asleep, because I have hauled a great many loads in my life, but I have never hauled one I liked less than this one. And a man who does not like his load ought to write down what he knows in case the load turns out to be the last of him. The crates in the second wagon and the third and the fourth are silver bullion belonging to no company that will admit to owning it, being the private stake of certain men in the territorial house who mean to have it out of reach before the audit next spring. And the gold in the tin under my seat is my own honest wage of 11 years put by, against my sister's girl who is 8 this fall and has nobody else. If you are the one that finds us, take the gold first, because it is mine to give and I give it, and take of the silver what you have need of and no more. and get word by any decent hand to a man named Josiah Blake at the assay office in Coyote Ridge, who is a friend and will know what to do with the rest, and will see that the girl gets her share. I rode with a freighter out of Bracken Wells years ago by the name of Thomas Fletcher, who was as straight a man as ever set a break, and if any of his people are still living in that country, you might ask after them. For his sort is the sort I would trust with this. I am tired tonight, and the wind is up. I hope whoever you are, you made it here in better shape than we did. And I hope you go home from here, wherever home is for you. Amos Kettleman, Wagon Master, 2nd of October. Alice Fletcher read the letter through once, and then she read it through again. And when she came the second time to the name Thomas Fletcher, written in the slow, careful hand of a man she had never met, she put the pages down flat on her knee and pressed her palm against them and sat for a long time without moving, while the wind pulled at the torn canvas above her head and the sweet mineral smell of the silver rose up out of the open crate beside her, and she understood, without any drama at all, that the wash and the wagons and the crates and the tin box and the letter had been waiting. In the way that certain things wait, for the one person in the territory who would know what to do with them. She folded the letter along its old crease and slid it back inside the oilcloth with the leather-bound book and the horn-handled knife, and she took up the tin box of double eagles and weighed it once in her hand, and she took 4 ingots of silver out of the open crate and no more, and she wrapped the 4 ingots in a torn strip of wagon canvas and lashed the bundle behind her cantle along with the tin box and the satchel. She closed the crate and set the iron bands back in their grooves and pressed the saved nails home with the flat of the rasp, so that a man riding past at a distance would see only what he had seen before, which was 6 broken wagons in a wash. She covered the 3 dead men as well as she could with strips of the torn bonnet canvas and weighed the corners with stones. And she said over each of them the plain words her mother had said over a neighbor's grave once, which was that the ground was patient and the wind was kind, and the rest was not for her to know. Then she watered the mule from the split molasses keg, which he would not touch, and from her own bag, which he drank slowly, and she rode out of the wash toward the notch in Coyote Ridge with the sun already low. She reached the town at mid-morning of the following day. Coyote Ridge was a single street of adobe and plank, with a livery at one end and a church without a bell at the other, and the assay office stood between them under a tin awning gone the color of a nickel. Josiah Blake was a small, square-shouldered man of about 60, with white eyebrows and ink on the fingers of his right hand. And when Alice Fletcher laid the letter open on his counter and set the horn-handled knife beside it, he read the 4 pages without speaking, and then he sat down on his stool and took off his spectacles and rubbed the bridge of his nose and said only, "So he is dead then?" And Alice Fletcher said, "Yes, sir, in a wash 2 days east." Josiah Blake locked the office and took her to the back room, where he weighed the 4 ingots on his beam scale and wrote the weights into a private ledger under a heading he printed neatly with his pen, which read, "Kettleman Trust," and he counted the double eagles in the tin box aloud with her. And there were 311 of them, which was to say $6,220 in gold, saved 11 years by a man for a girl of 8. Josiah Blake said the girl's name was Ellen, and she lived in Fort Purgatory with a widowed aunt, and he would ride himself with a witness to carry her share, and he asked Alice Fletcher what she meant to do. She said she meant to send word to the marshal about the wagons and the dead, and she meant to take honest wages for the finding and the carrying and no more. Josiah Blake looked at her a long moment and said that was well spoken, and he counted out $100 in coin from the Kettleman gold as a finder's wage and wrote it into the ledger under her name, which he asked her to spell for him, and she did. That afternoon she stood in the marshal's office and told her account plainly to a man named Deputy Hollis Reed, who was 34 and had been 6 years in the badge, and he wrote her words down in a bound book and signed the bottom and asked her to sign under his name, which she did with the same steady hand that had signed the paper at Reuben's table. By the next day, it was known in Coyote Ridge that the girl who had come in on a sway-backed mule had found the lost convoy, and by the day after that, it was known that she had brought in the wagon master's private savings for a child in Fort Purgatory and had asked for only a finder's wage. Josiah Blake rode out with Deputy Hollis Reed and 4 men in a borrowed freight wagon to bring back the silver and the bones, and when they returned 5 days later, the silver went into the vault of the assay office under seal, and the ingots were counted publicly on the boardwalk in the presence of the marshal. And the tally was 160 crates of 20 ingots each, a sum that made grown men take off their hats without knowing why. The territorial house never claimed a bar of it, because no man among them could claim it without ruining himself. And in the spring an inquiry was held in Santa Fe that turned quietly to nothing, and the silver remained in the vault under the Kettleman name until such use as Josiah Blake and a small committee of townsmen could put it to. Alice Fletcher took a room above the feed store for $2 a week, with a window that faced east toward the flats she had crossed. Ida Purcell, 61, the widow who ran the boarding kitchen, gave her a place at the long table without asking questions, and set down in front of her the first hot supper she had eaten since Reuben, which was pinto beans and shoulder of pork and cornbread cut in wedges from an iron pan. Amos Whitfield, 47, the smith, took her mule into his corral and reshod him without charge on the second day, saying only that the animal had carried her a long way and deserved better iron. Reverend Peter Coldwell, 52, walked her out to the little cemetery on the rise north of town and pointed to a plot of unbroken ground and said when the bones came in from the wash, the 3 men would be laid there under proper stones, and she was welcome to choose the words, and she chose for each of them the same words her mother had said, which were about the patient ground and the kind wind. Josiah Blake offered her a stool in the back of the assay office and taught her to read a beam scale to a quarter grain and to test a silver bar with acid on a black stone, and within a month she was keeping the Kettleman ledger in her own hand under his eye, and within 2 months she was signing receipts for small parcels on his authority when he was called away. She wrote to Ellen in Fort Purgatory a plain letter that said only that her uncle had loved her and had thought of her every day for 11 years, and she sent the letter with Josiah Blake and the first $1,000 of the gold. And Ellen wrote back a short letter in an 8-year-old's careful printing that Alice Fletcher folded and put into the oilcloth beside Amos Kettleman's letter and kept. By the end of her 3rd month in Coyote Ridge, people on the street spoke her name when they passed her. And Ida Purcell saved her the crust end of the cornbread, and Amos Whitfield tipped his hat, and children who had heard the story pointed at her from doorways until their mothers told them to stop. On an evening in the 4th month, Alice Fletcher climbed the outside stair to the room above the feed store and sat down on the edge of the cot with the window open to the east. The flats she had crossed lay out there under a lavender sky, and the dust of the day was settling, and the sound of the smith's hammer had gone quiet an hour before. On the little pine table she had bought for $1.40, she laid out the things that mattered. She laid out the brass pocket compass with the chipped glass and the needle that swung true, the compass Reuben had carried in his breast pocket for the better part of 40 years, and had put into her hand at the supper table when she was 15, and had said nothing at all in the giving of it. She laid it down carefully, opened the case, watched the needle settle north over the grain of the pine, and closed it again. Beside the compass, she laid the horn-handled pocket knife with the smooth, worn bone inlay that had belonged to Amos Kettleman, wagon master, 26 years on the southern freight roads, who had died with 3 of his men in a wash 2 days east of Coyote Ridge, and had thought, on his second night out of Fort Purgatory, to write 4 pages in pencil on ruled ledger paper to whoever might come after. She set the knife an inch from the compass, so that the 2 objects lay together on the pine, and she looked at them a long time. 2 things from 2 men who had never met each other and would never meet her as she was now, and both of whom had, in their separate ways, refused to leave a girl with nothing. She thought of Reuben in the chair by the stove with the coffee gone cold in his hand, and she thought of Amos Kettleman riding by lantern light with his back against a wagon wheel, and she thought of Marcus Holloway in the black coat counting 11 silver dollars onto her own kitchen table for the mule she had raised from a foal. And she found that she could think of Marcus Holloway now without any anger, only with a small remote pity, because he had signed a paper for a plank house and a tobacco tin under a floorboard, and had believed he had taken everything of hers, and he had not. He had not taken the compass. He had not taken the 7 years of Reuben's teaching. He had not taken her steady hand or her eyes or her ability to read a track in the dust or a smell on the wind. He had not, in the end, taken anything that could not be replaced, and he had missed entirely the thing he could not have known was hers to find. Downstairs, Ida Purcell called up the stair that supper was on the table, and Alice Fletcher answered that she was coming. She stood at the window a moment longer. Below her, the street was almost empty. 2 men were walking home from the livery, and a dog was crossing at an angle, and a lamp was being lit in the window of the assay office where Josiah Blake sometimes worked late over the Kettleman ledger she had written in her own careful hand. She put the compass into the inner pocket of her coat, where it had ridden for 200 miles of flats and lava and caliche, and she put the horn-handled knife into the pocket beside it, and she went down to eat. Alice Fletcher was 18, and she had been turned out of the only home she had ever known with $11 folded into the lining of her coat, and she had spent those $11 on a sway-backed mule and a week of hardtack and ridden west because there was nowhere else to go. It was the best $11 she ever spent. If this story stayed with you, if you sat down inside it the way Alice Fletcher sat down at that pine table with her 2 small objects laid out in front of her. Take a moment now to subscribe and to share this story with someone who has been turned out of a place and told they had nothing left. Because those are the people who most need to hear how a girl with $11 and a brass compass crossed a set of flats and found a wagon in a wash and became, in the space of 1 honest season, the person a whole town greeted by name on the street. And before you go, sit with this question a little while, the way the narrator has been sitting with it. What has someone tried to take from you that they could not, in the end, actually take? And what did you carry out of that room in your coat pocket that turned out to be worth more than everything they thought they had kept? Tell us in the comments where you're watching from, and if you're willing, what you carried out. We read everyone.